So this week we're focusing a bit on establishing rigor and trustworthiness in our qualitative research. And when we think about how you assess rigor in qualitative research, there are parallels to how we do so in quantitative research. And I want to put a caveat out there that it doesn't have to be this way, but it's a way that humans seem to want to do this. We know that quantitative research is respected, and qualitative research has often had to prove that it is as rigorous as other research methods. And so instead of just coming up with a qualitative way of assessing rigor, many researchers, better than me, have come up with ways that can be sort of paralleled with what is done with quantitative research. So it doesn't have to be this way, but that's how I've learned qualitative research, and it's how it's in your book. So there are parallel ways, but again, it doesn't always have to be so perfectly symmetrical between quantitative and qualitative research. And they're similar, but they're different. So just as you might not apply the rules or guidelines of baseball to football, both are sports and their rules and guidelines differ. So you wouldn't necessarily have parallel ways of looking at rigor in those sports, but some things will overlap with each other. So they're similar and different, like I said. Qualitative and quantitative research are both scientific and systematic methods to answering questions about a phenomenon or an action or a topic, right? But they're different in that they have distinct rules and guidelines that enhance rigor for their studies and the trustworthiness or believability of the data results, the interpretation of the data towards these results, and how you interpret the results themselves. So here I have a table that shows quantitative and qualitative and ways of answering 4 basic questions about the rigor of a study. So there's the truth value, the applicability of the research, the consistency of the research, and the neutrality within which the research was conducted. And I'd like to start by just, doing a quick review of quantitative methods. And this is definitely a review of something you've already learned and probably know very well, so bear with me. In quantitative research, you're looking for internal validity, external validity, reliability, and objectivity. Those are major things to look for in a quantitative study. Internal validity is the extent a measure actually measures what you're intending it to measure, and the extent that your causal results, that is, the relationship between 2 variables, are not impacted by confounding variables. So what a researcher would do here to enhance internal validity is to standardize methods and equipment and to control for anything that could be seen as a confounder. You only want to have one thing that changes, and that's the variable or the variables that you're looking at. Okay. External validity or generalizability is the extent your research can be applied to a larger population beyond your sample. So you want to make sure all possible participants have an equal chance of being included in the study, and that your sample is large enough to minimize the probability of error in your results, making it a statistically representative sample. Very different than what we've learned in qualitative research, which looks for purposeful sampling, right? Reliability is the extent a study can be replicated within subjects or over time. So you want to make sure your study can be standardized to the point that it can be replicated. So if there's any differences that you're finding in your data, it has nothing to do with how the study was given or how the study was done, but really what's going on over time or because of new variables. Objectivity is the extent that any biases on the part of the researcher or the participants is minimized. We know that there's biases all over the place, even in terms of what questions we ask or what topics we even choose to explore. But we want to make sure any biases are stripped away either through blinding the participants to what the research is about or what part of an experimental design they're a part of, or double blinding the researcher and the participants, or insulation so that there's no way that the researcher has any influence over the participant as they're taking part in the research. So for qualitative research, we look at credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. Credibility is sort of this idea of a truth value, while validity in quantitative methods refers to the correct operational measures for concepts being studied and the potential for cause-effect relationships between variables. Credibility in qualitative research deals with confidence that the findings are based in the realities provided in the data collected. The questions we ask are, do the findings show a logical relationship to each other? Are you weaving together a story? Are the findings grounded in the data? Were the data rich enough to achieve those findings? If the data is not rich, that means that the researcher is probably filling in some information based on assumptions that might not be accurate. Do participants or others like them agree with your findings or find them acceptable? So if you were going to say to your participants, I have preliminary findings from the interviews we conducted. Would you like to hear them and tell me what you think? Then you get an idea. Do these seem credible? Now, transferability is the qualitative analog to external validity or generalizability, where your findings may be applied to a wider population than your study sample. Transferability is based in the researcher's ability to provide evidence that the study and findings could be applicable to similar contexts and situations. And this is through thick description of their researchers' experiences while conducting the research and of the context of the research. Ultimately, with that rich description, the reader of the research should have the ability to decide if and how qualitative findings can be applied or transferred to their own context. This is why qualitative research does not try to control for external variables related to location, culture, and history. So consider my work with the rural women, the rural African American women living in North Carolina with breast cancer. If I read other qualitative research that had the similar context related to racism that could have even been conducted in another state in the United States, I might say, well, this is helpful for me to consider in my research because there is this historical or contextual richness that makes their findings something that I might look at and try to apply to my work. So it had to do with not just the actual findings of that research, but the context within the research and within which the research was conducted. So rich description is very important. Dependability is the qualitative term for something like the quantitative term reliability. In qualitative research, you would never expect a study or findings to be the same across people or even across time. It's just not inherent to a research process that is based in rich description of human experiences. Dependability is whether the research is carried out with attention to rules and conventions of the qualitative method, wherein the methods are consistent and the findings are consistent with the raw data collected. So questions we might ask in terms of, is this dependable? Are the research questions clear and logically connected to the purpose and design of the research? That is why I always stress that it's important to know the aims of your research, the purpose and the aims and the questions of your research before you choose what kinds of methods you're going to do to achieve those aims. If you like the photo voice process, that's great. But if your questions don't call for photo voice, it's not going to be very helpful. Other questions for dependability are the parallels across sources of data there? Do they make sense? Is there some consistency in terms of data collection protocols and analysis? So if you have other people working with you on your data, are you all training each other in how you're going to do your project so that it's consistent and differences are not due to the different researchers, but actually to the perspectives of the people that you're interviewing or observing or working with? Confirmability is the qualitative side of objectivity, where distance is maintained between researchers and participants to minimize influence. So, in qualitative research, this is not a strength. The strength of qualitative, where researchers are part of the research process. So, that is a strength of qualitative research. We're not trying to make the researcher insular or away from the participants. They actually come together to discuss or interact often in the qualitative research. Confirmability is confidence that the data reflect the participants' perspectives and experiences, and this often can require reflexivity of the researcher. Recording and identifying how they're being impacted by their own research, their own ideas about what's going on in the research, how their own perspective, their worldview might impact what they find in the research. So I'm going to stop here and then we'll continue on rigor and trustworthiness in another very, very brief slideshow.